You know that feeling when you open your mailbox and see an official-looking envelope? That moment where your stomach drops just a little because you know it's probably not good news. That's exactly what happened to David one Tuesday afternoon in late spring. He'd just gotten home from work, still in his button-down shirt with his tie loosened, when he grabbed the mail. Right there on top was a thick envelope from the Homeowners Association. The return address had that fancy logo with the little gates and trees that made the neighborhood look way more prestigious than it actually was. David had been living in Maplewood Commons for about 3 years at that point. It was one of those cookie-cutter subdivisions that popped up everywhere in the mid-2000s. Nice enough houses, decent neighbors, and a community pool and clubhouse that honestly, he barely ever used. Maybe he'd been to the pool twice the entire time he lived there. The clubhouse? Never. He wasn't really the community event type of guy. He tossed his keys on the kitchen counter and opened the envelope while standing there. The letter was printed on that heavy cream-colored paper that organizations use when they want to seem important. The subject line made his eyebrows shoot up. Important notice. Adjustment to monthly HOA dues. David scanned through the formal language and corporate speak until he got to the actual number. His monthly HOA fee was going up by $200. $200, starting next month. His dues had been $150 a month, which was already more than he thought was reasonable for a community pool he never used and a clubhouse he'd never stepped foot in. Now they wanted $350 every single month. He read through the explanation they provided. Something about rising maintenance costs, increased insurance premiums, and necessary improvements to the community amenities. The letter made it sound like they were doing everyone a huge favor by only raising it this much. There was also a not-so-subtle warning at the bottom about how failure to pay would result in late fees and eventually liens on the property. David sat down at his kitchen table and just stared at the letter for a minute. $200 a month was real money. That was almost $2,500 a year. He started doing the math in his head. That was a nice vacation. That was a used car payment. That was a lot of groceries. Something about it just didn't sit right with him. Sure, costs go up. He got that, but this was a massive jump. And they were giving homeowners basically no notice. Just a letter saying pay up or else. No meeting to discuss it. No breakdown of exactly where this money was going. Just corporate speak and demands. That evening, David couldn't stop thinking about it. He pulled out his old utility bills from the filing cabinet where he kept all his house paperwork. He wasn't really sure what he was looking for at first, but something was nagging at him. His electric bill had always seemed kind of high for his house. He lived alone, worked long hours, and wasn't home that much. Yet every month his bill was consistently between $250 and $400. Now David had an advantage that most people didn't. He was an electrical engineer. Not the kind that climbed poles and fixed power lines, but the kind that designed electrical systems for commercial buildings. He understood how power worked, how it was distributed, how to read electrical diagrams. It was literally his job. He went down to his basement where the main electrical panel was located. He'd been down there plenty of times to flip a breaker when he overloaded a circuit, but he'd never really paid close attention to the panel itself. It was mounted on the concrete wall near the water heater, a gray metal box that hummed quietly. David opened the panel door and looked at the layout. Most of it made sense. There were breakers labeled for different parts of his house. Kitchen outlets, living room, bedrooms, air conditioning, water heater, all normal stuff. But then he noticed something weird. There were 4 heavy-duty breakers at the bottom of the panel that weren't labeled. They were bigger than the others, the kind you'd use for major appliances or heavy equipment. He grabbed his voltage tester and checked the circuits. They were hot. Power was definitely running through them. But to where? He started tracing the conduit that led from these mystery breakers. It went up through the ceiling of his basement toward the back of his property. The next morning, David took a walk around his yard before heading to work. His property backed up to a common area where the community clubhouse and pool were located. There was a wooden fence separating his yard from the HOA property. He followed the fence line until he spotted what he was looking for. There, partially hidden by some overgrown bushes, was a large electrical conduit running from under his house along the fence, and then underground toward the clubhouse area. His heart started beating faster. No way. There was no way what he was thinking was actually true, but he had to check. That weekend, David drove to the county clerk's office. He pulled up all the property records for his house. The survey showed the exact boundaries of his lot. The electrical panel in his basement was definitely on his property. More importantly, it was his electrical service connected to his meter. Then he found the original subdivision plans from when Maplewood Commons was built. There it was, in black and white on the electrical site plan. The main service for the community amenities, the clubhouse, the pool equipment, the fancy lighting at the entrance, all of it was connected to the electrical panel at his address. His address, his meter. David sat back in the uncomfortable chair at the clerk's office and let out a long breath. For 3 years, he'd been paying the electricity bill for the entire HOA's community facilities. The pool pumps that ran day and night during summer, the clubhouse with its air conditioning and lights and kitchen appliances, the decorative lighting that made the neighborhood entrance look fancy every evening, the irrigation system that kept all the common areas green. All of it was running on his dime. He went back through his utility bills when he got home. He pulled out bills from before he moved in, which the previous owner had left in a folder with the other house paperwork. The bills went back about 5 years. He could see the pattern clear as day. During winter months when the pool wasn't running, his bills were reasonable, around $120 to $150. But from May through September, they jumped to $350, sometimes pushing $400. David did the calculation. Conservative estimate, he'd been paying an extra $200 a month on average over 3 years. That was $7,200. $7,200 of electricity costs that should have been paid by the HOA. And now they wanted to raise his dues by $200 a month to cover rising utility costs. The irony was almost funny. Almost. It would have been hilarious if he wasn't so angry. He spent the next few days digging deeper. He found an old letter in the house paperwork from the original developer to the first owner. It mentioned a temporary arrangement, where the community amenities would be powered from this lot until permanent electrical service could be installed. The letter promised a monthly credit of $75 on HOA dues as compensation. David had never received any such credit. He checked every single HOA statement he'd ever gotten. Nothing. When the house had been sold to him, apparently nobody had mentioned this arrangement. Not the seller, not the real estate agent, not the HOA. It had just continued on, quietly, with him footing the bill without even knowing it. He looked at that HOA letter again, sitting on his kitchen counter. $200 increase. For utilities they were already stealing from him. The anger he felt wasn't the hot, explosive kind. It was cold and calculating. They thought they could just push people around with official letters and legal threats. They probably did it all the time, counting on people to just accept it and pay up. But David wasn't most people. He knew his rights. He understood electrical systems, and he had proof of everything. He decided he was going to give them a chance to make this right. He'd approach them professionally, show them what he'd found, and give them the opportunity to fix their mistake and reimburse him. He was really hoping they'd do the smart thing. But something told him they wouldn't, and if they didn't, well, he had a plan for that too. After all, it was his electrical panel, his property, his meter, and he was pretty sure he knew exactly which breakers controlled all their fancy community amenities. David spent the next week putting together what he called his evidence package. He wasn't a lawyer, but he'd dealt with enough construction disputes in his engineering career to know that documentation was everything. You couldn't just walk into a meeting and say, "Hey, I think there's a problem." You needed proof. You needed receipts. You needed stuff they couldn't argue with. He made copies of everything. The property survey showing his lot boundaries, the original electrical site plan from the subdivision development, 3 years' worth of his utility bills with the suspicious charges highlighted in yellow, the letter from the developer to the first homeowner about the temporary arrangement, his HOA statements showing he'd never received any credit or compensation. He even printed out photos he'd taken of the electrical conduit running from his property to the community facilities. Then he did something smart. He hired a licensed electrician to come out and verify everything. The guy's name was Tony, and he had to do was flip them off. That's it. Just flip them off and the HOA would be in the dark, literally. But he wasn't going to do it yet. He'd given them 2 weeks, and he was a man of his word. He'd wait. He'd give them every possible chance to do the right thing. And when they didn't respond, or when they sent him some dismissive letter from their lawyer, then he'd act. He went upstairs and poured himself a drink. Then he drafted the formal letter he'd promised to send. He laid out everything again, attached copies of all his documentation, and stated clearly that he expected a written response within 14 days, outlining their plan for reimbursement and installation of proper electrical service. He sent it certified mail the next morning. Now all he had to do was wait and see if the HOA board was as stupid as he thought they were. Something told him they wouldn't disappoint. The 2 weeks crawled by like the slowest 2 weeks of David's life. Every day he'd check his mailbox hoping to see some kind of response from the HOA. Something. Anything. Even if it was just acknowledgement that they'd received his letter and were looking into it. Nothing. Not a word. On day 10, he got a certified mail receipt confirming that Patricia had signed for his letter. So they definitely received it. They just weren't responding. That told David everything he needed to know about how seriously they were taking his concerns. Then on day 13, he finally got something in the mail from the HOA. His heart actually jumped a little. Maybe they'd come to their senses. Maybe they'd realized this was a legitimate issue that needed to be addressed. He opened the envelope. It wasn't about his electrical situation at all. It was another notice about the dues increase, this time with an added note that failure to pay within 30 days would result in a $50 late fee, and continued non-payment could result in a lien being placed on his property. David actually laughed. He stood there in his kitchen and laughed out loud. They weren't just ignoring his complaint. They were doubling down. They were threatening him. After stealing thousands of dollars worth of electricity from him, they had the nerve to threaten legal action if he didn't pay them even more money. All right then. Message received. David took a personal day off work that Friday. He called Tony, the electrician, again and asked him to come by one more time. When Tony arrived, David explained what he was planning to do. I need you here as a witness, David said. I want everything documented properly so there's no question later about what I did and why I did it. Tony grinned. Man, I wish I could be here when they realize what happened. This is going to be good. They went down to the basement together. Tony took photos and videos of the electrical panel before anything was touched. He documented which breakers were which, showing clearly that the 4 large breakers at the bottom were connected to the conduit leading to HOA property. Then David did something very careful and methodical. He didn't just flip the breakers off. Any idiot could flip them back on if they got access to his basement. Instead, he physically disconnected the wires from those 4 breakers. He capped them off properly with wire nuts and electrical tape, following all safety codes. Then he removed the breakers entirely from the panel, but he didn't stop there. He installed a metal lockable cover over the section of the panel where those breakers had been. Then he mounted a very official-looking notice on his electrical panel. Tony had helped him draft it. Notice: the electrical service at this address is private property. The unauthorized connection to this service by community amenities has been terminated as of date. Any attempt to reconnect or access this electrical service without written authorization from the property owner will be considered trespassing and theft of services. All incidents will be reported to law enforcement and the utility company. Tony documented everything after it was done. He took photos, made detailed notes, and wrote up another report describing exactly what had been done and why. He even noted the time, 2:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon. There, Tony said, packing up his tools. All legal, all by the book, all documented. Nobody can say you did anything wrong. David paid Tony for his time and thanked him. Then he did something smart. He took his laptop, packed a bag, and drove to his brother's place about 40 minutes away. He didn't want to be home when the HOA realized what had happened. He wanted distance. Let them leave messages. Let them send emails. Let them even come knocking on his door. He wouldn't be there. He'd respond on Monday. On his terms. In his time. The effects started within a couple hours, though David didn't know it yet. He was at his brother's place having a beer and explaining the whole situation when his phone started buzzing. He'd turned off the ringer, but he could see the screen lighting up over and over. 7 missed calls. 15 text messages, 23 emails, and it had only been 3 hours. His brother Jake looked at the phone. Dude, I think they noticed. David smiled and took another sip of his beer. Let them notice. They had 2 weeks to respond like reasonable people. They chose to ignore me and threaten me instead. Now they can deal with the consequences. What David didn't know but found out later was exactly what was happening back at Maplewood Commons, and it was even better than he'd imagined. The first thing to fail was the pool pumps. The community pool was one of the main selling points of the neighborhood, and it was early June, prime pool season. The pumps ran constantly to keep the water circulating and filtered. When they stopped, nobody noticed right away. But the pool was open and kids were swimming. By evening, the water was already starting to look cloudy. The HOA had a pool service that came 3 times a week, and they showed up Saturday morning to do their usual maintenance. That's when they discovered the pumps weren't running. They tried to restart them. Nothing. They checked the breakers at the pool equipment shed. Everything looked fine on that end. The problem was upstream. The second thing people noticed was the clubhouse. There was a baby shower scheduled there Saturday afternoon. When the woman who'd booked it showed up to decorate, she found the building was completely dark. No power. The air conditioning wasn't running and it was already getting warm inside. The refrigerator in the kitchen wasn't working. Nothing. She called the number for clubhouse issues and got Linda, one of the board members. Linda didn't know what was going on. She drove over and checked the breakers at the clubhouse. Nothing tripped. She called the power company thinking maybe there was an outage. No outage reported in your area, the power company told her. Your meter shows active service to the residential address. The clubhouse must be on a separate meter. What separate meter? Linda asked. There's only one meter for the whole property. That's when someone finally put it together. There weren't 2 meters. There was only 1 meter and it was at David's house. And something had changed with David's house electrical service. The third thing to fail was the irrigation system. Maplewood Commons had these nice green common areas and they stayed nice and green because of underground sprinklers that ran every night. Saturday night, they didn't run. By Sunday afternoon, with temperatures in the low 90s, the grass was already starting to stress. But the worst thing, the thing that really caused chaos, was the wedding reception. A young couple had booked the clubhouse 6 months earlier for their wedding reception Saturday night. They'd paid a hefty deposit. They had 70 guests coming. They'd hired a caterer who needed the kitchen and the refrigeration. When they arrived Saturday evening to find the clubhouse without power, there was panic. The bride was in tears. The groom was furious. The caterer was threatening to leave because they couldn't keep the food at safe temperatures. The DJ couldn't set up without power. The air conditioning wasn't running and the building was like an oven. Someone finally tracked down Patricia's number. Patricia showed up in her weekend casual wear. Clearly annoyed at being bothered, she made some calls. She got the HOA's handyman to come look at it. He traced the electrical line and discovered it went to a property on Maple Drive. David's property. Patricia tried calling David, straight to voicemail. She sent texts. No response. She even drove to his house and knocked on the door. Nobody home. The wedding reception had to be canceled. They tried to move it to a nearby restaurant on short notice, but couldn't accommodate 70 people. The whole thing was a disaster. The bride's family was threatening to sue the HOA. They wanted their deposit back plus damages for emotional distress and the ruined reception. By Sunday morning, the situation was critical. The pool was getting worse. The clubhouse was unusable. The grass was dying, and Patricia had finally figured out what happened. David had cut their power. He'd actually done it. She called an emergency board meeting Sunday afternoon. All 5 board members gathered at Greg's house since they couldn't use the clubhouse. Patricia's face was red with anger. That little punk disconnected us, she said. He actually cut our power. Can he even do that legally? Greg, who always acted like he knew more than he did, shook his head. It's his property. I looked it up. The electrical panel is on his land. Technically, I think he can do whatever he wants with it. We need to get an electrician out there to reconnect it, Brett said. Like immediately. Do we know anyone? Linda spoke up quietly. I already called 3 electricians. They all said the same thing. They can't access electrical equipment on private property without the owner's permission. They said if we want power, we need to either get David's permission or install our own service. How long would that take? Patricia demanded. They estimated 6 to 8 weeks minimum, plus it would cost around $20,000. The room went silent. $20,000 they didn't have in the budget. 8 weeks without power at the community facilities. The pool would be ruined. The grass would die. They'd have to cancel all the clubhouse reservations and probably issue refunds. "We need to call our lawyer," Patricia finally said. "This is illegal. He can't just cut our power. We'll get a court order forcing him to turn it back on." But when they talked to the HOA's attorney Monday morning, he didn't give them the answer they wanted to hear. After reviewing the situation, he told them point blank that David was within his rights. He owned the property. The electrical service was in his name. There was no legal easement or recorded agreement giving the HOA rights to that service. Even worse, the attorney pointed out that the HOA had been stealing services from David, not the other way around. If this went to court, the HOA would almost certainly lose and probably end up paying David's legal fees on top of everything else. "Your best option," the attorney said, "is to negotiate. Settle with him. Pay him what he's asking for and get your own electrical service installed. The longer you wait, the worse this gets." Patricia couldn't believe what she was hearing. Give in to David, pay him, after he'd sabotaged the entire community? But she didn't have a choice. The phone calls and emails from angry residents were piling up. The bride's family had hired their own lawyer. The pool service was saying the pool might need to be drained and refilled if it got much worse, which would cost thousands. Every day without power was costing the HOA money and credibility. David's phone continued to blow up all weekend. He didn't answer any of it. He stayed at his brother's place, relaxed, watched some basketball, and enjoyed knowing that somewhere across town, the HOA was finally understanding that they'd messed with the wrong guy. Monday morning, he drove home. There were 3 notices stuck to his front door, 2 from the HOA demanding he call them immediately, and 1 from the local police asking him to contact them regarding a civil dispute. David called the police first. He spoke with an officer who'd taken a complaint from Patricia. David calmly explained the situation and offered to email all his documentation. The officer listened and then said something that made David smile. "Sir, this sounds like a civil matter between you and your HOA. From what you're telling me, you've disconnected electrical service on your own property that others were using without authorization. I don't see any criminal activity here. I'd suggest you folks work this out yourselves." David thanked him and hung up. Then finally he called Patricia back. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was tight and controlled. "We need to talk." "I agree," David said calmly. "I gave you 2 weeks to respond to my concerns. You chose to ignore me and threaten me instead. So now we're going to talk on my terms." Monday morning came with a strange kind of tension hanging over Maplewood Commons. It was the kind of tension you could almost feel in the air. Like everyone knew something big was happening, but nobody quite knew what to do about it. David sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking at his phone. He had 47 missed calls now, 63 text messages, and so many emails he'd stopped counting. Most were from Patricia and other board members, but some were from neighbors he barely knew. Word was spreading fast. He decided to check the neighborhood Facebook page, something he usually never did. Big mistake, or maybe not, depending on how you looked at it. The page was absolutely exploding. People were posting photos of the cloudy pool water. Someone had shared a picture of the dead grass in the common areas. There were angry posts from people who'd had clubhouse reservations that week. And right at the top, pinned by Patricia, was a post that made David's blood boil. "Due to vandalism by a resident, community amenities are temporarily unavailable. We are working with law enforcement to resolve this criminal matter. Updates to follow." Vandalism. Criminal matter. She was actually trying to make him look like the bad guy. David screenshotted the post because he had a feeling he'd need it later. The comments under Patricia's post were interesting, though. It wasn't the unified support she probably expected. Some people were definitely on her side, calling whoever did this selfish and demanding they be fined or even arrested. But others were asking questions. What kind of vandalism? Why won't you give us details? How does someone vandalize the community power? I heard someone on the board messed up and this is being covered up. Someone named Rachel had posted, "My husband is an electrician and he says there's more to this story. Community facilities are supposed to have their own power service. Why don't ours?" That comment had 32 likes and was growing. David's phone rang again. Patricia. He let it go to voicemail. Then immediately another call came in from a number he didn't recognize. He answered it. "Is this David Chen?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Christine Moore. My daughter's wedding reception was supposed to be at your clubhouse Saturday night. It was completely ruined. No power, no air conditioning, food going bad. Do you have any idea what you've done? David took a breath. Mrs. Moore, I'm very sorry about your daughter's reception. I truly am. But I need you to understand something. The HOA has been stealing electricity from my home for years without my permission or knowledge. I've paid thousands of dollars for their utilities. When I discovered this and asked them to make it right, they ignored me and threatened me with legal action. So I disconnected service that was illegally hooked up to my property. There was silence on the other end. Then they were stealing your electricity? Yes, ma'am. I have documentation. Property records, utility bills, professional electrical assessments. All of it. The HOA told us it was vandalism, that someone sabotaged the power maliciously. That's not true. Would you like me to email you copies of my documentation? You can see for yourself what happened. Another pause. Yes, I would like to see that. Because if what you're saying is true, then the HOA is responsible for ruining my daughter's wedding, not you. David got her email address and sent her everything. Within 20 minutes, she called back. Oh my God, she said. You're completely right. Those documents are clear as day. The HOA has been stealing from you, and then they had the nerve to threaten you? That's exactly what happened. My lawyer is going to love this. We're already planning to sue the HOA for breach of contract and damages. Now we have proof they were operating facilities with stolen utilities. Thank you for sending this. After he hung up, David felt a little better. At least one person understood what was really happening. But the day was just getting started. Around noon, there was a knock on his door. David looked through the peephole and saw two people he didn't recognize. A man and a woman, both in business casual clothing. The woman was holding a folder. He opened the door. Can I help you? Mr. Chen? I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News, and this is my cameraman, Phil. We're doing a story about the situation here in Maplewood Commons. Do you have a few minutes to talk? David's first instinct was to say no. He didn't want to be on the news. But then he thought about Patricia's Facebook post calling this vandalism and a criminal matter. Maybe it was time people heard the truth. Sure, he said. But I want to make something clear first. This isn't vandalism. This is me stopping theft of my services after the HOA refused to address the issue reasonably. Jennifer smiled. That's actually exactly what we want to talk about. We've been speaking with other residents and we're hearing there might be two sides to this story. They set up in his living room. David showed them everything, the same documents he'd been showing everyone else. Jennifer's eyes got wider as she looked through them. So you're saying the HOA has been using your electricity, without your knowledge, for at least 3 years? At least. Probably longer. I've only owned the house for 3 years. The previous owner might have been paying for it too and not even known. And when you brought this to the HOA's attention, they ignored me. Then they threatened me with legal action if I didn't pay an increased HOA fee, an increase of $200 a month, supposedly to cover utility costs. The same utilities I was already paying for. Phil kept the camera rolling while Jennifer asked more questions. David stayed calm and factual, just laying out what had happened step by step. What do you want from the HOA? Jennifer asked. Originally, I wanted reimbursement for what I'd already paid, and for them to install their own proper electrical service. That's it. I wasn't looking for revenge or trying to hurt anyone. I just wanted them to stop taking advantage of me. And now I want the same thing. But I also want them to be honest with residents about what happened. That Facebook post calling this vandalism and a criminal matter, that's defamation. I'm the victim here, not the criminal. The interview lasted about 30 minutes. Jennifer said the story would air on the evening news. David wasn't sure if that was good or bad, but at this point the truth needed to come out. After they left, David's phone rang again. This time it was Greg from the HOA board. David, we need to resolve this today. The situation is out of control. I agree it's out of control, David said. But it didn't have to be this way. I gave you 2 weeks to respond reasonably. Look, I'll be honest with you. Patricia screwed up. She should have taken your concerns seriously. Some of us on the board didn't even know about your letter until this weekend. She was handling it or not handling it on her own. That was interesting. Internal board conflicts. Okay, so what are you proposing? We want to meet. The full board, you and our attorney. We need to work out a settlement. I'm not turning the power back on until we have an agreement in writing, David said firmly. We understand that. Can you come to an emergency board meeting tonight? 7 p.m. at my house since we can't use the clubhouse. David thought about it. I'll be there, but I'm bringing my own documentation and maybe recording the meeting for my records. That's fine. We just need to resolve this. The rest of the afternoon was chaos in the neighborhood. David could see it from his window. People were standing around in small groups, talking and gesturing. Someone had hung a banner by the pool that said, "Fix our pool." A few people walked by David's house slowly, looking at it like it was some kind of crime scene. Around 3 o'clock, something else happened that David hadn't expected. His doorbell rang again. This time it was Kevin, a guy who lived a few houses down. David had talked to him a few times, mostly just neighbor small talk. "Hey man, I just wanted to say I think what you're doing is right," Kevin said. "I've been dealing with this HOA for 5 years and they've been a nightmare. They fine people for the stupidest things, they waste money left and right, and they never listen to homeowners. I'm glad someone finally stood up to them." "Thanks," David said, genuinely surprised. "I wasn't trying to be a hero or anything. I just wanted them to stop stealing from me." "Yeah, but you did what a lot of us have wanted to do for years. You fought back, and honestly, people are starting to wake up to how badly this board has been running things." Over the next few hours, 3 more neighbors came by with similar messages. Not everyone supported him. He could see that from the look some people gave his house, but more people than he expected were on his side. At 6:30, David got in his car and drove to Greg's house for the meeting. When he arrived, all 5 board members were there, plus a man in a suit who introduced himself as Robert Chen, the HOA's attorney. No relation, apparently. The mood in the room was tense. Patricia wouldn't even look at David. Linda looked stressed and tired. Brett kept checking his phone. Greg and the other board member, whose name was Anne, at least seemed willing to talk. Robert, the attorney, took control of the meeting. "Let's start with the basics. Mr. Chen, you've disconnected electrical service that was powering HOA amenities. The HOA wants that service restored. What are your terms?" David pulled out a folder. "My terms are the same as they were 2 weeks ago. First, reimbursement for electricity costs. I calculate that at $7,200 over 3 years. Second, the HOA needs to install their own electrical service for community amenities within a reasonable time frame. Third, I want my HOA dues waived until the reimbursement is paid off." Patricia finally spoke up. "That's ridiculous. We're not paying you $7,000 because of some arrangement that existed before any of us were even on the board." Robert held up his hand. "Patricia, let me handle this." He turned to David. "The problem, Mr. Chen, is that the HOA doesn't have $7,200 sitting in reserves. We'd have to do a special assessment on all homeowners, which requires a vote and takes time." "That sounds like a HOA problem, not a David problem," David said. "You've been benefiting from stolen services. The fact that you don't have the money to pay for it doesn't make it okay." "What if we offered a payment plan?" Robert suggested. "Say $2,000 up front and the rest paid over 12 months. David considered this. "What about the electrical service installation?" "We've already gotten quotes. It'll take about 6 weeks to get it done. We can start next week if we authorize it." "And my legal fees? I had to hire an electrician twice to document everything." Linda spoke up. "How much were your legal fees?" "About $500 so far." Robert made a note. "We can include that in the settlement." They negotiated for another hour. David stood firm on most of his points, but he was willing to be reasonable on the timeline for payment. Finally, they worked out an agreement. The HOA would pay David $7,800 total, which included reimbursement and his documented expenses, $3,000 up front, and the rest in monthly payments over 18 months. They'd begin electrical service installation within 2 weeks. His HOA dues would be waived for 2 years, and Patricia would post a correction on the Facebook page explaining that the power situation was the result of a billing dispute, not vandalism. That last point, Patricia fought hard against, but the attorney made it clear, if you don't correct that defamatory post, Mr. Chen has grounds to sue you personally. Not just the HOA, your choice, she agreed, but looked like she'd swallowed something bitter. Robert drafted the agreement right there and everyone signed it. David had one more condition, though. "I want it clear that I'm not restoring full power immediately. I'll restore temporary power to prevent damage to the pool and keep grass alive. But the full connection doesn't get restored until the permanent electrical service is installed. I'm not going back to being your free utility company." They agreed to that too. As David left Greg's house that night, he felt exhausted but satisfied. He'd won. Not completely, not perfectly, but he'd stood up for himself and forced them to make things right. When he got home, he went to his basement and reconnected just enough power to keep the pool pumps running and the irrigation working. The clubhouse would stay dark until they got their own service. That seemed fair. The next morning, David woke up to a strange sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't stressed about the HOA situation. He had a signed agreement. He had witnesses. He had everything documented. The fight was basically over. He made coffee and checked the neighborhood Facebook page, curious to see if Patricia had posted the correction like she'd agreed to. Sure enough, there it was, posted at 11 p.m. the night before. Update regarding community amenities. After investigation, the power issue was the result of a billing dispute between the HOA and a resident regarding electrical service costs. This is not a criminal matter. We apologize for any confusion. Power has been partially restored to prevent property damage. Full restoration pending installation of new electrical service. It wasn't exactly a ringing apology, but it was honest. The comment section was wild, though. People were demanding details. Some were angry at David for cutting the power. Others were angry at the HOA for creating the situation in the first place. A few were asking hard questions about how the board could let something like this happen. One comment stood out. It was from Rachel, the woman whose husband was an electrician. I've been doing some digging into our HOA finances. Did you know the board pays themselves $500 per month each as administrative fees? That's $30,000 a year going to 5 people for what's supposed to be volunteer work. Also, the landscaping contract went to the company owned by Patricia's husband, and we're paying 40% more than market rate. I think it's time for a financial audit. That comment had over 100 likes. People were waking up. David's phone buzzed. It was a text from Greg. Check bounced. Coming by at 9 a.m. with cash. That made David smile. They were serious about paying him. Good. Greg showed up right on time with an envelope containing $3,000 in cash. Counted it twice, he said. It's all there. Thanks, David said, taking the envelope. How's the board handling all this? Greg sighed. Not well. Patricia is furious. Brett's talking about resigning because he doesn't want this on his record. Linda feels terrible about the whole thing. And people are asking a lot of uncomfortable questions about how we've been running things. Maybe that's a good thing, David suggested. Maybe. Greg paused at the door. Look, for what it's worth, you were right. We should have listened to you from the start. Patricia gets very defensive when anyone questions anything, and the rest of us usually just go along with it because it's easier. That was wrong. After Greg left, David went to the bank and deposited the cash. Then he did something he'd been planning. He printed out copies of the entire story. All his documentation, the settlement agreement, everything. He made 20 copies and put them in his car. That evening, there was a regular HOA meeting. Not an emergency meeting, just the normal monthly meeting that was open to all residents. David had never gone to one before, but he decided tonight was the night. The meeting was at Greg's house again since the clubhouse still didn't have power. When David arrived, he was shocked by how many people were there. Normally, these meetings had maybe 5 or 6 homeowners show up. Tonight, there were at least 40 people crammed into Greg's living room and spilling out into the hallway. Patricia called the meeting to order, but before she could get through the standard opening remarks, hands shot up all over the room.